This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. Shalom Aleichem, Bruchim Haba, and we continue in Mishna Daf Hashavua, where we began Siman Yud Beis yesterday. The Mechaber said that if all the strings of the corner snap, and you have the amount that you can make Kedei Aniva, you can make a bow around all the strings that are snapped, it's kosher. But if you don't have Kedei Aniva, the Mechaber said, even on one string, meaning shenifsa kulai, that it's entirely snapped, it's puzzle. So what we have to understand is, are we talking about the 4 strings or are we talking about the 8 strings? When we say that if one string is snapped, is it one of the 8 or one of the 4? One of the 4 would mean that on both ends of the 4, it's snapped in both places. So what does it mean that even b'chud echad shenifsa kulai pasal? So, by the way, yesterday we learned that if you take off the tzitzis, you're not allowed to put them on a talis acher, even if one of the strings is missing Yud Beis Gudalen. So right, because the Shiur of the strings is Yud Beis Gudalim, even if one of the strings is missing Yud Beis Gudalim, is going to be an issue. So we saw in Siman Yud Aleph, Sif Daled, that the length of the strings have to be 12 Gudalim. And when we say the length of the strings, the 8 strings, okay, so the H, in other words, after it's put through the hole and it's made, and you make a knot, it has to be after you put it through the hole, each side has to be Yud Beis Gudalim. So it says in Mishna Berura, Siv Katan Gimel, Shenifsa Kulai, that it entirely snapped. Ratzaloymar Shebishnei Rashav, that on its 2 ends, Leinishtayr Kedei Aniva. You don't have Kedei Aniva on both ends, Pasol, Av Sheshar Hachutin Hayishleimim, even though the other strings are whole. Vim Nishtayer B'Shneim Kedei Aniva Idei Tziruf. What if, basically, if you add up, if you combine both of the ends on the 2 sides, you could create a Kedei Aniva, then Yesh L'Stapik Mahani. It's a suffix if it's going to help. The Chazon Ish sort of wonders, how in the world could you join up 2 halves, neither one is Kedei Aniva, to join up to be a shiur? Each enough has to be a shiur in and by itself. So the Chazon Ish does not feel it's a suffix, but the Mishna Berura does. You should be machmir, namely, you need to have Kedei Aniva on each side. In other words, if it's only Kedei Aniva to combining the 2 ends together, it's not going to work. You need to have at least one side that's Kedei Aniva. Now you have a very interesting suffix. First of all, if you combine the 2 ends, then you get Kedei Aniva. And it could be these 2 ends are not even from the same string. They could be from different strings. So in that case, of the 4 strings, each one has Kedei Aniva. In other words, it's really a sveka. Number 1, maybe you could combine 2 half pieces to be Kedei Aniva. And even if you can't, maybe these 2 ends are not from the same string. So it should be a sveka lahakel. Vimkein yesh kan sveka shemay mishnei chutim. Maybe there are 2 strings, and even if they're 1 string, v'shem mitztarfin, afilu hachi yesh lachmer. Why? Mishum the tzitzis mitzuyin heim. Don't rely on kulas. Go to the store and buy a new pair. It's not a big deal. Even though, by the way, nowadays it's more expensive. It's probably more expensive than it ever was. But nevertheless, people have money and they could buy a new pair. It's less than a tank of gas. The Artzis Achayim Meiko b'choin zeh. The Artzis Achayim is Meiko by the Svek v'nira dem yesh be'echad me'arashin kedei lanov chud echad. If on one of the ends you have kedei aniva, not of all the strings, but of one of the strings, so then you have a svek, sveka. And bevada yish tasmachal, you definitely could rely on it. What's the svek, sveka? Number one, maybe the two snapped strings are from two different strings. And even if it's from the same string, maybe you could be mitzdaref two half pieces. And even if you can't be mitzdaref, well, one of the ends is kedei aniva, not all the strings, but at least over one string. That's also a snif lahaka. Okay. So even b'chud echad, shenifsa kulei pasal. Ayin lekaman b'sif gimel. We'll see later on in Sif Gimel that what it means kedei aniva. Ulekulei im nifsak chud echad me'ikarai. Everyone agrees that if one string got snapped from its source, the hainu b'makam chiburi b'kanav, that is where it attaches to the corner, the pasal. Because of Ataz, the Taz writes, Al kein roi l'chol yirei shemayim. Therefore, it is fitting for every God-fearing person, she'ya'ayin b'shas b'dika, that you should be ma'ayin at the time of checking, gam b'tchilas maitzam shal tzitzis, even from where the tzitzis come out of the corner, the hainu b'makam chiburi b'kanav, where it's attached to the corner, im yesh sham kara, if there's a tear. So when you check your tzitzis, aside from checking the strings and that they're not snapped, you should also check that there's no snap where you put it into the garment, as well as the garment itself. Okay. The Mechaber continues. Hilkach, therefore, kivan shekol echad kafel l'shnayim. Since each string is doubled over, im nifseku shnei rashim pasal. If two ends are snapped, it's going to be pasal. Shama nifsak chod echad, because maybe the two of them are the same string. And if you have one string, shenifsak kulai, it's pasal. Says the Mishna Berura, shnei rashim. So if two ends are snapped, v'loi nishtar b'shem echad mehem kedei aniva, you don't have kedei aniva on either end. If one of them has kedei aniva, then it's for sure kosher. Why? Because the only psul is if one of the four strings doesn't have kedei aniva. But if on one end you have kedei aniva, then this string, even though on the other side you don't, but on this side you do. Shema nifsak rotzoloymar af im shnei hanifsak mitzad echad. That means like this. You know, when you double over the tzitzis, so you have four on one side, four on the other. So you would think, okay, now I have 8 strings coming out. If 2 of the strings on the right side are snapped, you say, well, they're obviously from different strings. No, because you might not have been careful when you were winding and tying that the 4 on the right always stay on the right and the 4 on the left always stay on the left. You may have mixed and matched as you were knotting and winding. So even though the 2 that snapped are on one side, they actually may be the same string. That's why it is preferable that when the tzitzis are made, and I do think that our tzitzis that come with the hechsher of all the great rabbis in the world, now how they get a hechsher from rabbanim who haven't been alive in many, many years, I don't know. It's one of the miracles of the mitzvah of tzitzis, how you could have Gedolei Yisrael who were nifter in the 19th century give a hechsher to your tzitzis. But I do think that they are makbid to make sure that the 4 on the right stay on the right, 4 on the left stay on the left. Okay. Interesting question that the Dirshu brings up. Why don't we follow Roiv? Namely, right now I have a string, it's snapped. I have another string that it's snapped. Isn't it more likely, doesn't Roiv say that the string that's snapped is not the same, does not belong to this string, it's a different string, because out of the 4 strings, it's more likely it's from a different string. Why don't we follow Roiv? And I would add, it's a Ruba de Isa Kaman. It's not just like a Roiv Ba'alma. It's out of factors that are present in front of us. So Rabbi Yosef said, because you can't follow a Roiv if it's Afshar Levarer. So undo it, untie it, and check whether it belongs to the same string. Okay, the Mechaber continues. And in accordance with what we are careful when we make the tzitzis, to make a siman on the four ends, in a way that the four ends are always on one side of the knot. So then, if you have two snapped strings on one side, it's going to be kosher. Then there's certainly two different strings. You already have left over on the second end, which is going to be more than the amount to make a bow. By the way, the Mechaber said that if you don't have Kedei Aniva, even B'chud Echad, where the whole thing snapped, it's pasul. So the Bir Halacha says the same thing would be if the tzitzis snapped by the wound part between the knots. If it's one string, it will be kosher because you have Kedei Aniv on the other side. Vim shnei chut and pasul. So it's not just in the string part if it's snapped, but likewise in the winding part. Okay, Rabbi, so we're going to hold it over here, and we will continue tomorrow with Sif Katan Zayin in the Mishnah Berura. Wishing everyone a great day. Kol Tov.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.